The entire conference room went still the moment Diana Harlow pulled her hand back. It was not a dramatic gesture. She did not make a scene of it. She simply looked at the man standing across the table from her, took in the worn lapels of his jacket, the scuffed edges of his leather briefcase, the way his shoes had been resoled at least once, maybe twice, and she withdrew her extended hand before it could meet his. She turned toward her assistant instead, and said quietly, but not quietly enough, "Can you make sure facilities knows we have a guest who needs directions to the correct floor?" The man standing across from her did not flinch. His name was Gerald Sutton. He was 58 years old. He had driven himself to the meeting in a 7-year-old Buick that he had not bothered to trade in, not because he could not afford to, but because the car ran fine, and he had never seen the point of spending money to impress a parking garage. He was wearing the same navy blazer he had worn to his son's college graduation 4 years ago. He had not thought to replace it. He looked at Diana Harlow for a moment, at the way she had already turned away from him, at the slight lift of her chin, at the studied efficiency with which she dismissed what she had decided he was, and he closed his briefcase. Not because he had opened it, he hadn't. He simply rested one hand on the clasp and stood there for a breath, 2 breaths, and then he said, very evenly, "I think I have the right floor." Diana did not look back at him. She was already speaking to the man on her left, something about the afternoon schedule, her voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who considers an interruption already resolved. The assistant, a young woman named Patricia, who had been with the company for 11 months, and would later describe this morning in her resignation letter, looked at Gerald Sutton with an expression that was equal parts apology and helplessness. He gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "It's all right, none of this is your fault." Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out. The building was called Harlow Tower, which told you most of what you needed to know about Diana Harlow. She had commissioned the name herself 6 years ago, when Harlow Capital Management had relocated its headquarters to the 41st floor of a building she did not own, but had negotiated the naming rights to anyway. It was the kind of move that impressed certain people enormously and struck others as faintly embarrassing. Diana had never particularly cared which category any given person fell into. She had built the firm from a regional wealth management boutique into something that managed close to $9 billion in assets. She had done it through a combination of sharp instinct, relentless hours, and a gift for reading which opportunities were real and which were theater. For most of her career, that last skill had served her exceptionally well. The meeting that morning had been arranged 3 weeks earlier by her head of business development, a man named Clark, who had flagged the incoming inquiry with one line in an email. Sutton Group, private family office looking to allocate significant capital, requested meeting directly with you. Diana had approved the meeting without asking many follow-up questions. She received a dozen such inquiries a month. Most of them went nowhere. A few became clients. She treated them all with the same efficient hospitality until she had enough information to decide which category they belonged to. She had decided about Gerald Sutton in the first 40 seconds. She could not have articulated her reasoning precisely, which should have worried her and did not. It was something about the jacket, something about the briefcase, which was old in a way that did not suggest taste or heritage but simply age. Something about the fact that he had arrived alone, without an attorney or an advisor or even an assistant, which in her experience meant one of 2 things. Either the person was extraordinarily sophisticated, or they were not sophisticated at all. She had looked at Gerald Sutton and concluded the latter with a confidence that felt, to her, like professional judgment. It was not professional judgment, but she would not understand that for another 6 days. Clark found out first. He had been in a different conference room during the meeting and had not witnessed what happened. He learned about it in pieces, from Patricia, who mentioned it while scheduling the afternoon, and then from 2 of the analysts who had been in the room and could not quite bring themselves to pretend they hadn't seen it. By 2 o'clock, he was sitting in Diana's office with his laptop open and a look on his face she had never seen from him before. "I need you to look at something," he said. Diana looked. She read for a moment, then looked up. "What am I looking at?" "The Sutton Group," Clark said. "The actual Sutton Group. Not what we assumed it was." She looked back at the screen. Clark had pulled up 3 sources, a Forbes profile from 4 years ago, that had been published under the headline "The Invisible Billionaire," a Wall Street Journal piece from 18 months prior about a series of infrastructure acquisitions in the southeastern United States, and a brief item from a business journal in Tennessee that mentioned, almost in passing, that Gerald Sutton had recently donated $40 million to a children's hospital in Knoxville without requesting his name on any of the buildings. The Forbes profile had a photograph. It was Gerald Sutton in the same navy blazer, standing in front of what appeared to be a very ordinary house. Diana set down her coffee cup. "He manages his family's capital directly," Clark said. "No external advisors, no institutional intermediaries. He's done it that way for 20 years. The family office has roughly—" He paused, as if he was not quite certain he should be saying the number out loud, $3.4 billion under management. All private. All his. The room was very quiet. He was looking to allocate, Clark continued, keeping his voice neutral with visible effort, somewhere in the range of $200 million. Based on the inquiry, he'd been considering 3 firms. We were one of them. Diana did not say anything for a long moment. Outside the window, 41 floors down, the city moved with its usual indifference. "Get him on the phone," she said finally. Clark looked at the table. "I already tried. His office said he's not available. Today, indefinitely." She tried herself that evening from her personal cell. The call went to a voicemail that gave only a name and a number, and nothing else. She left a message that she spent 20 minutes composing in her head before she made the call, and that still came out wrong. Too smooth, too practiced. The voice of someone who was accustomed to recovering situations rather than genuinely regretting them. Gerald Sutton did not call back. She tried again 2 days later. Then she had Clark reach out to his assistant. Then she had her attorney make a quiet inquiry through a contact. Each attempt returned the same answer, delivered in different registers of politeness. Mr. Sutton was not available. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Gerald Sutton had by that point already moved on. Not in anger, not in the active nursing a grievance way that she might have expected. He had simply moved on the way a man moves on from a road that turns out to be closed. Without drama, without looking back, choosing a different route. He had scheduled a second meeting with one of the other firms the following week. He had not thought about Harlow Capital Management again in any meaningful way. He had, however, mentioned the morning to his son. His son's name was Daniel, and he was 31. And he worked for his father in an unofficial capacity that had no title, because Gerald had never been interested in titles. Over dinner that evening, takeout from a Thai place they both liked, eaten at Gerald's kitchen table, Daniel had asked how the meeting went, and Gerald had considered the question for a moment. "It didn't," he said. Daniel looked up from his food. "The woman who runs the firm," Gerald said, "decided I wasn't worth her time before I'd said a word." He said it without bitterness, which was somehow more affecting than bitterness would have been. She pulled her hand back, in front of her whole team. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "What did you do?" "I left." Gerald picked up his fork. "Not much else to do." Daniel nodded slowly. He was thinking about something, but he didn't say what. He had learned growing up that there were very few situations that required him to say anything. The call that changed things came on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the meeting. Diana was in a strategy session with her senior partners when her assistant interrupted to say that Raymond Chu was on the line. Raymond Chu was, among other things, the head of institutional relations at a sovereign wealth fund that had been in early-stage conversations with Harlow Capital for over a year. A potential mandate worth, conservatively, $400 million. The kind of relationship Diana had spent 18 months carefully building. She took the call in her office. Raymond Chu was pleasant, as he always was. He expressed appreciation for the relationship, as he always did. And then he said, in the same pleasant voice, that they had decided to move in a different direction with the allocation, and that he hoped she understood it was nothing personal, and that he looked forward to future opportunities to work together. Diana thanked him. She hung up. She sat in her chair for a moment. She called Clark. "Find out," she said, "where that allocation went." It took Clark 4 hours. When he came back, he stood in the doorway of her office with the expression he'd been wearing more and more lately, the one that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "The Whitmore Fund," he said. "Out of Nashville." Diana was still for a moment. "That's a Sutton operation." It was established 8 months ago. Registered in Tennessee. Gerald Sutton is listed as a principal. She stared at the surface of her desk. She was not a woman who lost composure easily, and she did not lose it now. But something shifted behind her eyes. A recalibration. The slow and uncomfortable arrival of a conclusion she had been avoiding. Is there anything that connects this two? There's no way to know, Clark said carefully. Raymond Chu isn't going to tell us, and it may not be connected at all. He paused, but the timing is what it is. The timing was what it was. Over the following 2 months, Diana Harlow watched 3 more institutional relationships quietly cool. Not dramatically, not all at once. In the ordinary, undramatic way that relationships cool when someone, somewhere in a network she could not see, has a conversation she is not present for. A lunch where a name comes up. A phone call where a question is answered with a brief, considered silence. A referral that does not materialize. A meeting that is scheduled and then, somehow, never confirmed. She could not prove any of it was connected to Gerald Sutton. She never could prove it. That was the nature of the thing. The invisible architecture of reputation. The way it is built slowly over decades and can be altered in ways that leave no fingerprints. Gerald Sutton had not made calls on her behalf. He had simply, when asked, told the truth. When Raymond Chu had mentioned over dinner in Nashville 2 weeks after the meeting that he was in early conversations with Harlow Capital, Gerald had nodded and said mildly, "I met Diana Harlow recently," and Raymond had waited, and Gerald had said nothing else for a moment, and then he had changed the subject. That was all. Raymond Chu was a man who had spent 30 years reading what people did not say. He had drawn his own conclusions. The invisible billionaire, the Forbes piece had called him. The writer had meant it admiringly, had meant to convey something about humility, about the quiet accumulation of wealth and influence that did not require an audience. But reading it now, Diana understood something the writer might not have fully intended. The thing about invisible power is that you cannot negotiate with it, cannot charm it, cannot outmaneuver it. You can only hope that you have not, at some previous moment, given it a reason to notice you. She had given it a reason. The annual industry conference in Atlanta that October was the first time Diana had been in the same room as Gerald Sutton since the morning in the conference room. She saw him across the reception hall. Same blazer, or one indistinguishable from it, holding a glass of water and listening to someone with the particular quality of attention that she had learned, too late, was his most distinctive trait. He was not scanning the room. He was not performing accessibility or importance. He was simply listening completely to the person in front of him. She crossed the room. She did not know exactly what she intended to say. He saw her coming. She could tell by the slight shift in his posture. Not a stiffening, not a retreat, just an acknowledgement. He said something quiet to the person he'd been speaking with, and by the time Diana reached him, he was standing slightly apart, giving her the space of a private conversation. "Mr. Sutton," she said. "Mrs. Harlow," he said. She had prepared several versions of what came next, and standing in front of him, she abandoned all of them. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I did in that meeting room was disrespectful, and it was wrong, and I want you to know that I'm aware of that." He looked at her for a moment. His expression was not cold, and it was not warm. It was the expression of a man who is actually listening to what is being said, rather than formulating his response. "I appreciate that," he said. "I don't expect it to change anything," she said. "I'm not saying it because I think it will." He studied her face for a moment longer. "Why are you saying it?" It was a genuine question. She could tell because he was waiting, actually waiting for the actual answer. She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. Part of it was regret. Part of it was the aftermath of 2 months that had been the most professionally difficult of her career. Part of it was something she was less comfortable naming. The slow, dismantling recognition that she had made a judgment about a human being in 30 seconds and had been wrong in every particular. And that this wrongness had not been a fluke but the expression of a habit she had been practicing for years, in ways she had simply never had to pay for before. "Because I think I needed to say it to someone," she said. "And you're the person I should say it to?" Gerald Sutton was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his glass of water, then back up at her. "All right," he said. They stood there for a moment in the noise of the reception, and then someone came to speak with him, a man in a good suit who called him Gerald and shook his hand with the warmth of a long friendship, and Diana stepped back, and that was the end of the conversation. She walked back across the reception hall. She picked up a glass of something from a passing tray and stood near the window and looked out at the Atlanta skyline and thought about the morning in the conference room, which she had been thinking about in one form or another for 2 months. She had been wrong about Gerald Sutton. That part was clear, but the part that stayed with her, the part she could not set down, was not the wrongness of the particular judgment. It was the certainty of it, the absolute, effortless certainty with which she had looked at a man and decided what he was and what he was worth, without asking a single question, without a moment of hesitation. She had done it and felt nothing, because it had felt like clarity, like professional discernment, like the fast, efficient sorting mechanism that had, she had always believed, contributed to her success. She thought about how many other mornings there had been like that one, how many other people she had sorted with the same fast, effortless certainty, and she thought about how many of them she would never know about, because they had not been Gerald Sutton, had not had $3.4 billion to move and a network that intersected with hers. They had simply been people she had dismissed before they could say a word, and they had left, and she had never heard from them again, and she had taken that silence as confirmation. She set down her glass. The man across the room, she could still see him, now laughing at something, the laugh quiet and genuine, had not set out to teach her anything. He had not been making a point. He had simply withdrawn from a situation in which he had been treated with contempt, the way any person with any self-respect eventually does, and the consequences of that withdrawal had rippled through her professional life in ways that were still not finished rippling. He had not done it to her. He had simply done what the situation required, and the architecture of consequence had done the rest. She had built her career on the premise that the surface of a person told you most of what you needed to know. She had been efficient about it. She had been very, very good at it. She had never, until now, had to sit with what that efficiency cost. Harlow Capital Management did not collapse. That is worth saying plainly, because the story does not end that way, and the ending it does have is perhaps more instructive. The firm contracted. Over the following 18 months, assets under management declined from $9 billion to roughly $6.5 billion, significant, though not fatal. Diana restructured the senior team. Clark stayed. Patricia, who had filed her resignation 3 weeks after the conference room morning, did not come back. 3 of the institutional relationships that had cooled did not return. 2 of them did eventually, in attenuated form. Diana hired an executive coach, which she had always privately considered an indulgence for people who couldn't think clearly on their own. She found, somewhat to her irritation, that it was useful. She did not cross paths with Gerald Sutton again for 2 years. When she did, at another conference in a different city, he was talking to a group of young fund managers, and she watched him from across the room for a moment before deciding not to approach. He was answering a question, and she was too far away to hear the words, but she could see the quality of his attention. The way the young woman asking the question had it, fully, completely, the way you rarely have anyone's full attention in a room full of people who are all quietly deciding what everyone else is worth. She turned and walked toward the other end of the room. There were things she understood now that she had not understood before. She understood that the habit of dismissal is not an instinct sharpened by experience, but a comfort taken on, in lieu of the harder work of actual attention. She understood that certainty about other people is almost always the first sign that you have stopped looking at them. She understood that a man could walk into a room in a worn jacket and resoled shoes and be the most significant person there, and that this was not a parable about judging books by their covers, not exactly, because the lesson was not about hidden wealth, not really. The lesson was about the cost of deciding before a word is spoken that you already know. Gerald Sutton, for his part, did not think about Diana Harlow very much. He had a firm to run, and a son he had dinner with twice a week at the kitchen table, and a hospital in Knoxville that had recently asked him to consider funding a new pediatric wing, which he was thinking about. He was not a man who carried things that did not belong to him. He had left a conference room 11 months before, when a woman had pulled her hand back, and he had gone down 41 floors in an elevator and walked to his car in the parking garage and driven home and eaten lunch and gone back to work. The world had not held its breath. Nothing had stopped. Only the things that were always going to happen had happened, in the order they were always going to happen in. That is how it usually goes, with people who have nothing to prove.